the Western Hemisphere. Nobody has to be reminded of the long and deep involvement of the United States in the hemisphere and obviously our deep economic and strategic interests in it, nor do you have to be reminded of the perplexing questions of the moment, not the least of which is that interesting phenomenon of the movement toward leftist governments in a handful of countries. But to deal with this, the variety of interests and policies in the hemisphere, we're very, very fortunate to have an authoritative voice, that of the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Department of State. Dr. Shannon, our guest, is a graduate of William and Mary College, BA degree in Government and Philosophy, and his MA and PhD degrees are in politics from Oxford University. He's a career member of the Foreign Service. The first 15 years or so of his service included mostly stations abroad. He's been in Guatemala City, Brasilia, Johannesburg, and Caracas. And for the last half a dozen years, he's held a series of senior positions. He served as Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the Organization of American States. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, specializing in Andean affairs. He served as a special advisor to the President and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. And then a year ago, approximately in October of 2005, began his present post as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. It's a great honor to have him with us, and my enormous pleasure to present to you the Honorable Thomas A. Shannon, Jr.
Good afternoon, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here today. It was great to have a reason to escape from Washington and get into Maryland, especially to Baltimore, which is one of my favorite cities, not just because of the Orioles, but also because of the Inner Harbor and the wonderful restaurants. In fact, coming up here was a little hard. I was explaining that I almost didn't make it because I almost by habit I tend to turn right at Camden Yards. Or just keep going to Little Italy. And in fact, I've walked past this building so many times I can't even count, kind of going back and forth, either from the aquarium to the Inner Harbor or over to Camden Yards, and I've never had an opportunity to actually come inside. So this is a great chance for me to see the inside of this building and also see the great view it has of the harbor. But again, bless you. But again, I want to thank you all and appreciate this opportunity to talk a bit about something that's important to me, which is the Western Hemisphere, and as we call it, the Americas, stretching from Canada to the tip of Chile and Argentina. When I entered this business 22 years ago and started with a posting in Guatemala, the bureau that I worked for at the Department of State was called the Bureau of American Republic Affairs. And it didn't include Canada. At that time, Canada was part of Europe. We didn't do geography real well. But only a few years ago, Canada kind of made an important decision, which was to join the Organization of American States. And upon joining the Organization of American States, we recognized that we had to somehow accommodate a member of the Commonwealth, a country that was not a republic. And therefore, we moved Canada out of the Bureau of European Affairs and moved it into the old Bureau of American Republic Affairs and renamed ourselves the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Now, I oftentimes get questions, well, how'd you figure out Western? Why isn't it North and why isn't it South? And I don't have a good explanation for that, except to say that we do take a certain amount of pride in telling people within the State Department that our bureau is the only bureau that has the word hemisphere in it. In other words, we're in charge of half the world, and the rest of the State Department has to deal with what's left. But it's I hear we have until 7:10, and my hope is actually to hear from you all, your questions, but especially your comments. Because one of the problems that we sometimes have in Washington is I get to travel a lot in the region. In fact, just last week I was in Brazil and Colombia. But what I don't get to do too much of is actually travel around the United States and talk about the Americas, talk about the Western Hemisphere, talk about why it's important to us and what we're doing in the region. But also, more importantly, try to understand from all of you how you see what we're doing and how you see the Americas and the Hemisphere and where you see problems and issues. And both through your questions and your comments, I learn a lot. And what I'd like to do this evening, if it's okay with all of you, is talk a little bit about how we see the region, especially how we structure our policy, what it is we're trying to do and accomplish, and then a little bit about some of the challenges we face, and then try to get to some kind of dialogue as quickly as we can. This is a challenging moment for those of us who work in the Hemisphere. If you look out over the Hemisphere, what you oftentimes see is a politically contentious region in which recently governments have emerged with a kind of an anti-American tinge to them. The press oftentimes talks about a trend towards leftism in the region and a decline in American influence, and worries that our larger security efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the global war on terror have somehow directed us away from the Hemisphere, away from the Americas, and have caused us to lose some focus. And what I hope to do tonight is to try to convince you that, at least from our point of view, that's not the case. In fact, although obviously the United States is a global power, and as a power which was attacked on September 11th and has responded to that attack, at the same time has been able to maintain a focus on the Americas, and not only maintain a focus and pursue interests, but also integrate that and use it towards a larger global policy. And I think it's important to start, if you let me do this, back in 2001 at the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City. It was the first Summit of the Americas attended by President Bush, his first kind of major multilateral event. And what was striking about the 2001 summit is that it coalesced thinking that had been pursued in two previous summits, in 1994 in Miami and then later in Santiago, Chile. And the 2001 summit produced a leaders' document in which the democratically elected leaders of the Western Hemisphere, the 34 leaders of the Hemisphere, committed themselves to democracy as a form of government and as the only legitimate form of government in the Hemisphere, committed themselves to promoting prosperity in the Hemisphere through free markets and economic integration, committed themselves to investing in the people in the Hemisphere by building up personal capacity so that people could actually take advantage of the economic opportunity that would be presented through free markets and economic integration, and focused on education and health care as the primary drivers of building personal capacity. And finally, committed themselves to protecting the security of the democratic state, and recognizing that in a hemisphere committed to democracy, that ultimately the principal security challenge was not going to come from state-on-state violence. It wasn't going to come from one nation fighting another. It was going to come from non-traditional actors, from organized crime, from terrorist organizations, from drug traffickers, but also from natural disasters, environmental disasters, and pandemics, and that the region needed to begin to construct organizations within the Organization of American States or new forms of organizing within the inter-American system to address all of these problems, to look for ways to consolidate democracy, to look for ways to promote prosperity and open markets and facilitate economic integration, to look for new and innovative ways to address development issues in the countries in the hemisphere, and then to fashion a security cooperation which just wasn't military-to-military cooperation or cooperation between armed forces, but also involved cooperation between law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, environmental protection agencies, and those agencies that addressed disaster preparedness. And in many ways, 2001 was seen as a moment in which the Hemisphere came together in an unusual way and sketched for itself not only a common set of principles, but also a common agenda for the Hemisphere. And as important as that was, it also presented a significant challenge in the sense that as the populations of the Hemisphere, as the citizens of the Hemisphere began to understand the import of what their leadership had committed itself to, they did a remarkable thing. They took it seriously. They took the commitment to democracy seriously. They took the commitment to prosperity seriously. They took the commitment to investing in people seriously, and they took the commitment to security seriously. And by taking it seriously, they began to ask that their governments be accountable. And they developed their own expectations about what those governments had to do. And what we've seen since 2001 is I think, an important deepening and strengthening of democracy in the region, but also an important challenge to democracy. Because ultimately, if democracy is going to be meaningful, especially in a hemisphere where 200 million people live in poverty, and by poverty I mean they live on $2 a day, and 80 million people live in critical poverty, and by critical poverty I mean they live on $1 a day. Governments have to deliver. They have to be able to meet the needs of their most needy and their most vulnerable. And as these poor, marginalized sectors of society flow into political systems, institutions are challenged. And they're challenged in dramatic ways. And what we've found since then is that some countries have the capability, the institutional capability and institutional capacity to address these expectations, to channel all of this upsurge in popular expression, to channel through democratic institutions the conflict and confrontation which historically had taken place outside of formal institutions of government. But in some countries, the institutions aren't up to the challenge. Either they're weak, or they're debilitated, they're corrupted. And by institutions, I'm not only speaking of the formal institutions of government. I'm not only talking about the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, law enforcement agencies. I'm also talking about political parties and especially civil society and the civic traditions that undergird a society and act as connectors, especially in societies that are fragmented or fractured. And while there has been a lot of discussion about the emergence of leftist governments, especially in South America, from our point of view, from the point of view of not only the Bush administration, but the United States government, we don't look out over the region and try to identify if a government is right of center, center, or left of center. When we look out over the hemisphere, what we're looking for really is not ideology, but it's values. It's commitment to democracy. It's commitment to the economic models that we think are necessary for prosperity. And it's commitment, and we look for a commitment to investing in people, and especially looking for ways through good governance, through rule of law, through fighting corruption, through putting the kinds of investment that are necessary in education and healthcare, that a society is able to develop the individual capacity for people to take advantage of economic opportunity. And ultimately, this last aspect is very important for the well-being of democracy, because ultimately in the Americas, not only in the United States and Canada, but also from Mexico south, citizenship has to be understood as much more than political. It has to be understood as much more than voting, or being a member of a political party, or attending political events, or speaking freely. It also needs to be understood in its economic and social terms. People need to feel that they're economic citizens, that they have some investment or some part of the economic development and well-being of their country. And they have to be social citizens also, which means that they cannot feel marginalized, they cannot feel excluded, they cannot feel that they don't have a voice or a part not only in their national destiny, but also in their individual destiny. And therefore, one of the things that President Bush and his administration has focused on is building relationships throughout the hemisphere that are dedicated to good governance, that are dedicated to reducing levels of confrontation and promoting levels of cooperation and collaboration. And again, this makes for an odd mix, at least for those who following the Central American wars of the 80s and following so much of a Latin American policy over time, which has been really an indirect expression of a larger Cold War policy, to find ourselves in a moment in which ideology kind of washes away, and instead what we're focused on is values and identifying problems and then looking for practical solutions. It creates interesting bedfellows. For instance, Brazil, with their president, Ignacio Lula da Silva, who is a trade unionist, born in the most extreme poverty and raised in poverty, who worked his way through the trade union movement and became and founded one of the most important modern political parties, not only in Brazil but in South America, the Workers' Party. And although having lost several elections, eventually did win a presidency. But shortly after winning the presidency, came to the United States, met with President Bush, established a personal friendship, and then developed a easy, fluid communication that allowed U.S.-Brazil relations, I think, to reach one of the most developed and sophisticated moments in its history, and have allowed us, even though we have significant differences on big policy issues globally, and we can talk about some of those later, to focus on, as we talked about earlier, implementing this common agenda in the hemisphere and also beyond. For instance, the United States and Brazil today are cooperating in Guinea-Bissau on projects devoted towards promoting institutional democracy in that African country. And this is the first time that the United States and Brazil have worked together on a political institutional development project. The United States has also developed very close relationships with other governments that are considered left of center, whether it's under Ricardo Lagos in Chile and now Michelle Bachelet, who will be coming up on June 8th to meet with the president at the White House, whether it's President Tabaré Vázquez of Uruguay, whether it's President Nestor Kirchner of Argentina. And the point here is to highlight the fact that what we're focused on is how we can work in the hemisphere to consolidate democracy and to draw this linkage between democracy and development and show that ultimately democracy can deliver the goods. And I mentioned earlier that this is important for us not just in the region, but it's also important for us, I think, more broadly in our global agenda. And the reason I say that is because the U.S. government has a democratization agenda, which is an important component of what it's doing, not only in the Middle East, but also in South and Central Asia and in Africa and in East Asia. But in some ways, the Western Hemisphere is a hemisphere that has gone through an important democratization phase. It moved from authoritarian governments to elected governments. But now it is facing what, for lack of a better term, I'll call kind of second-generation challenges to democracy. And those are the ones that I've just kind of outlined, which is how democratic governments deal with popular expectations, how having successfully moved politically from authoritarian governments to elected governments, and having moved from closed economies to open economies, how they link the two and actually begin to provide the kind of development that its citizens expect and demand and ultimately will hold governments accountable for. And we have to be able to address that problem here in the Western Hemisphere. Because if we can't address it here, where effectively we have a common agenda and a common set of political values, then how are we going to do it in the Middle East? How are we going to do it in South and Central Asia, where societies don't necessarily have shared values, they don't necessarily have the level of civil society development that we see today. And so from my point of view, and I believe from the point of view of Secretary Rice and the President, that when they talk about transformational diplomacy, when they talk about how we take societies and show that democracy, instead of being a conservative form of government that is really designed to protect the interests of a privileged few, is actually a revolutionary form of government that gives voice to people who historically and traditionally don't have voice. And in so doing, actually creates an environment in which people will gain access to the resources that they need in order to become full members of their society. And in this regard, I'd like to kind of point to the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City in 2001. And at that summit, as I noted, the leaders committed themselves to democracy. And when I say they committed themselves to democracy, what I mean is that they said that to be a part of the summit process, a country had to be a democracy, and that any country that suffered a democratic or constitutional rupture would be examined by the leaders to determine whether or not they should still be part of the summit process. That was a significant step on the part of the leaders, but also a significant threat, which meant that in the case of a country kind of falling away from democracy, its access to the summit process would be threatened. But what the leaders also did is they instructed their foreign ministers to negotiate a document called the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And that charter was negotiated, and it was approved on September 11th, 2001 in Lima, Peru. September 11th is an historic day. And I was in Lima with Secretary Powell for that special extraordinary General Assembly of the Organization of American States to approve the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And Secretary Powell was at breakfast with the Peruvian President Alejandro Toledo when the first reports came in of the attack on the Twin Towers in New York and then the attack on the Pentagon. But Secretary Powell did not leave immediately after getting word of the attacks. In fact, he went to the OAS General Assembly and said that in the face of these attacks, which were obviously attacks not just on the United States, but on open societies and free economies, that the most important thing he could do was stay in Lima until the OAS General Assembly had approved the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Because what's important about the Charter is that not only does it kind of codify within the inter-American system democracy as the only legitimate form of government, but it also creates, through the OAS, the means and processes whereby the inter-American system, all the members of the inter-American system, can reach out and help those countries that find themselves in democratic crises. In other words, it is really an instrument of solidarity and an instrument of assistance to countries who recognize that their democratic institutions face challenges, and a strong symbol that countries aren't alone in this political battle. And as you can guess and imagine, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was approved that day. Secretary Powell did return to the United States. His was the only aircraft allowed into the United States that day. As you remember, all airports were shut down. Looking back on the Charter and its importance, there are two other things worth mentioning. First, the first article of the Charter says that democracy is the right of all the peoples of the Americas. And this in and of itself is a pretty dramatic statement, because if you talk to most international lawyers or people who study these things, they'll oftentimes tell you that democracy is a form of government, and it is really an expression of or a product of a series of rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of belief. But to describe a system of government as a right is a striking thing. And what the foreign ministers were attempting to do when they approved this was to say that in the Americas, democracy is more than a form of government. It's a description of a state, that we live in democratic states, and that it is a right of all citizens to be part of that democratic state. And the second part of the first article says that democracy is essential to the social, political, and economic development of the Americas. And I mentioned earlier about democracy being a revolutionary concept in the Americas. And this second part of the first article really captures that revolutionary aspect of democracy, because what the foreign ministers were saying through the charter, and what the 34 democratic countries that are members of the Organization of American States were saying through the charter, is that for development to really happen, for it to be true, it has to be done democratically. And this also is a striking statement, because there are many people in the world who argue that the kinds of development problems we face throughout the world are so significant and so contentious that only authoritarian governments can manage them, that only governments who monopolize force and who can require people to turn over resources are capable of really doing the kind of wealth redistribution and the redistribution of economic opportunity that is sometimes required for social and economic and political development. But what the countries of the Americas were asserting is that this can be done democratically, that it has to be done democratically. And this is a huge challenge, and it's the kind of challenge that we're facing today. Let me talk just a moment about populism in the Americas, because this is another topic which is current, especially in the aftermath of the election of Evo Morales in Bolivia, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, and upcoming elections on Sunday in Peru. In fact, we've got, if I counted them all, we probably have 10 elections, presidential elections this year in Latin America, but still before us, we have the Peruvian elections, we have the Ecuadorian elections, we have the Brazilian elections, we have the Venezuelan elections, we have the Nicaraguan elections, and the Mexican elections, and I'm sure I missed one. But there is in those countries that are the most institutionally challenged, to use a phrase, where political parties historically have become clientelistic and corrupt, where civil society has not fully developed as kind of the connective tissue within a political system, and where civic traditions really haven't been able to bridge the fragmented nature of these societies. The institutions are not capable of channeling all of the popular upsurge in political activity based on a recognition by all members of these countries that they have a democratic right to participate. And so the tendency is for this popular upsurge to kind of overflow the banks of institutions. And populism becomes kind of the political floodplains of democracy. Sometimes there's a tendency among people who comment on the region to treat populism itself as if it's dangerous, and to treat populism as if it presents a threat to democracy. What I would argue is that populism is really a natural phenomenon in a democracy which is struggling with its institutions, and that instead of criticizing the leaders who are elected or criticizing the voters who elected them, what we need to do is focus on helping these countries build up the institutions necessary to rechannel this political participation. And we have to recognize that in the United States, we've had moments of populism, whether it's Andrew Jackson, whether it's William Jennings Bryan, whether it's Bob La Follette, whether it's Ross Perot, whether it's the many political movements that emerged during the Great Depression. But one of the aspects of U.S. history is that at moments in which populism has emerged, that our institutions have evolved rapidly to adapt to it. Our political parties have opened themselves. Our governments have recognized and looked for ways to reach out to these groups. But more importantly, we've been blessed at key moments in our history with political leadership that had the wisdom to reach out to those people who found themselves on these political floodplains and kind of pull them back into institutions. And not all countries have been blessed with this kind of leadership. But what the Americas has through the Inter-American Democratic Charter is a means of providing solidarity and help to countries who find themselves in this condition. And this is why we believe that countries that do find themselves struggling institutionally, do find themselves in moments of populism, need to be engaged with, that there needs to be a clear expression and a willingness to work with these countries and to help them through this moment. Ultimately, it's up to the countries to themselves to determine whether or not they want this help. But within the larger context of the Americas, this is, I believe, a moment in which, if we are able, through the mechanisms we have in the inter-American system, to show that we can help countries address their institutional failings, that we can show that we can help them put in place the kind of policy tools they need to govern well and justly. And if we can find ways to provide the resources that they require to meet some of the really crushing social demands they face, we will have accomplished a remarkable thing. And I'd like to close by talking a bit about what we do in terms of resources in the region and also in terms of our policy engagement. And the reason I'm going to do this is that, as I mentioned at the start, we sometimes hear that the United States has walked away from the region, or that it's been too busy doing something else to really pay attention to what's going on in the region. And I hope I've kind of sketched out for you a level of understanding of what's happening in the region and a level of political engagement in the region that will convince you that we not only have our eye on the place, but we're right in the middle of it. But in terms of resource allocation, when President Bush took office, the United States was spending about $800 million a year in Latin America and the Caribbean in foreign direct assistance. Foreign direct assistance is a term that covers basically all of the different categories of assistance that we have, from development assistance to economic support funds to food for peace monies to our counter-drug accounts. And what this administration has been able to do effectively is double that amount on an annual basis. Right now, we spend between $1.6 billion and $1.8 billion dollars a year in foreign direct assistance. And since that's annual expenditure, over the past 4.5 to 5 years, this administration has put an additional $5 billion into the region. It's also brought kind of new sources of funding. I noticed that your next event here is going to address the Millennium Challenge Account. The Millennium Challenge Account and the organization that manages it, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, was established by the administration in the aftermath of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Monterrey, Mexico. And the purpose of the Millennium Challenge Account and the corporation is to refocus significant chunks of U.S. assistance to those poor countries that are making the right policy decisions. And it was part of a kind of new development dynamic or paradigm which was worked out at the Monterrey Conference, in which effectively donor countries would make a commitment to developing countries that were prepared to commit to making the right kinds of policy choices. And what the administration has done in the region is sign Millennium Challenge compacts with countries that meet the indicators necessary to participate in the Millennium Challenge account. And I'm not going to kind of steal the thunder from your next speaker, but in the Americas so far, compacts have been signed with Honduras and Nicaragua. I think $225 million in Nicaragua and $175 million in Honduras. We're close to signing a compact with El Salvador. We are in the midst of talks with Bolivia about a compact. And we have a program called Threshold Programs, which provides some money to those countries which still haven't met the indicators necessary to be part of the larger Millennium Challenge account program, but which are close. And we have threshold programs in Paraguay and in Guyana. But effectively, when you add these all up, at this exact moment, this puts about another $500 million into the region. and then through the administration's emergency plan for AIDS, the administration has put about another $500 million into the region to provide antiretroviral treatment for people who are HIV positive and to provide other assistance to fight AIDS. I kind of lay this out because it's important to understand what the resource flows are. Another thing that this administration has done is it's increased spending in the Peace Corps by about 30 or 40%, which means that there are about 1,000 more volunteers in the Americas than there were previously. And that's significant, actually, because Peace Corps volunteers tend to work in regions that many people from embassies don't get to. And they work at a community level, which is not only important for the development of the communities, but it's also important for how people perceive the United States. But more importantly than even all of our formal assistance, which is necessary in some instances as a catalyst. But at the end of the day, although $1.8 billion is doubling what has been spent previously, looked at in terms of our larger budget, it's not a huge amount of money. But also if it's looked at in terms of other resource flows into the region. And I'll give you just a few examples. Many of you here must be familiar with remittances, which is the money that is sent out from the United States back to the countries where workers come from. And the Inter-American Development Bank estimates that about $43 billion a year is sent from the United States to Latin America and the Caribbean by Latin American and Caribbean citizens working in the United States. Some documented, some undocumented. That's a lot of money. Mexico gets about $20 billion of that. That is about equal to what Mexico earns through its tourism industry. In Honduras, remittances equal the amount of money that Honduras makes in its banana industry. And what this means is that remittances have become an incredibly important part of the economies of Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and those Andean countries that have significant numbers of workers here, mostly Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. Some of you might be surprised to learn that there are 2 million Brazilians living in the United States today. So the United States really has seen a significant change in terms of migration coming from the region, and that this has an impact not just in the United States, but it has an impact in the sending countries, and the remittances are an important aspect of that. But also, if you look at our trade policy and what we've been able to do with our free trade agreements, but also preferential access programs, about 2/3 of all the exports entering the United States from Latin America enter duty-free. And today, that's over $200 billion. And again, that's a significant amount of money. And it makes the region attractive to investment, especially investment in companies that export back into the United States. And finally, in terms of foreign direct investment, U.S. companies have over $300 billion invested in Latin America in a variety of forms, but many of them in productive activities, in industry and services. So you have an economic relationship in which the region is kind of deeply penetrated by American capital. There are profound personal linkages because of migration and because of remittances. But also the United States finds itself in a situation in which it is targeting those countries that it believes are making the right kinds of decisions and providing assistance to them to try to find ways to ensure that their democratic institutions succeed, that they have the ability to promote prosperity in their countries, and that they're capable of investing in their own people. I think I'll stop there. I would really appreciate your comments, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for a wonderful overview. The Secretary has asked for comments as well as questions, which is often a controversial thing here. But in any case, comments or questions, please be terse so that as many can be heard as possible. The question is, would you comment on immigration? The term used was invasion. Immigration, whether legal or illegal, And would you comment upon its impact upon the character of the United States now and in the future?
Yeah. Obviously, this is an issue of great import right now in the United States and one of great political debate. As you know, the House of Representatives has passed an immigration reform bill. The Senate has passed an immigration reform bill, and very soon the House and the Senate will be in conference trying to determine what comes out. And it's an important moment in the United States. It's also an important moment, I think, in the Americas for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, because there are approximately, it's hard to get the figures right, but there are approximately 40 million Hispanics living in the United States. I'm not quite sure how many Caribbeans. And, you know, if you believe the demographers, anywhere from 10 to 12 million are illegals or undocumented aliens. What the president has sought to do, and he did this several years ago in a speech in the East Room of the White House, but he's continued to do it consistently in his public comments about immigration, is to recognize that for the United States to secure its frontiers, to secure its borders, it needs to have secure frontiers, but it needs to do more than that. Because at the end of the day, you cannot secure the United States only at the borders. You need to find a way to understand what has driven this migration to the United States. Look for ways to channel it and regularize it in a manner that allows us to understand who is in the United States and what they're doing in the United States. And that also allows us to focus on that much smaller group of people who present a direct security threat to the United States. And what I mean by that is that the president's policy is through immigration reform to strengthen the frontiers, strengthen the borders, improve what's called interior enforcement, which is going after undocumented aliens and employers away from the border in Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, New Orleans, you name it. And, but to recognize that most of the people who come to the United States come to the United States to work, and that there is an economic component to this, and that we need to find a way to link what the president calls willing workers and willing employers. And by doing that, we will know who's in the country, where they are, where they work, and what they're doing. And we will be able not just to meet a manifest economic need of the United States, but also a security need, and that therefore our Border Patrol and our local police and our FBI and other people who track potentially dangerous people are not going to have to worry about sifting through 12 million undocumented aliens, because the vast majority of them will have already been tagged in one way or another through a temporary workers program. That instead, we'll be looking at a much smaller group. From my point of view, this is a sensible approach to U.S. security. It's a sensible approach to a migration which is really historic in its nature. Well, I mean, what we have seen over the past decade, and when it finally plays itself out, will be equal to what the United States experienced during the great European migrations, both from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and the Asian migrations from Japan and China. And just as it will have an impact on the face of the United States, as I mentioned earlier, it also has an impact in the region. And it creates linkages that ultimately can be very advantageous if they're managed properly. But as this debate goes forward, we have to recognize that there are a wide range of opinions. And what the president has sought to do in his responses to the concerns of U.S. citizens is to look for a way to make sure that this debate is conducted in what he calls a civil manner, in a respectful manner. And what he means by that is not to necessarily restrict or limit the passion by which people that people feel about these issues or their real concerns about these issues. It's to make sure that at the end of the day, everybody understands we're not only talking about people, we're talking about the hemisphere in which we live, and we're talking about the countries in which we have close and productive relationships, and that we need to understand that we don't live and cannot live isolated from the region, but that we live in a region that is undergoing profound change.
Would you comment on the impact upon that immigration and how we handle it, the impact that it has on our relations with other nations in the hemisphere?
Well, as you can imagine, many countries in this hemisphere have been watching this immigration debate very closely. And they've watched it closely for two reasons. First, because their citizens are here, and they have an interest and a responsibility towards those citizens. But secondly, as I mentioned earlier, these citizens send money back to their home countries. And the money that these countries get, as I noted, is incredibly important. You know, not many studies have been done about the impact of remittances in the societies where these people come from. But a study was done in Mexico by CEPAL, or ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission on Latin America. It's a UN organization. And this study indicated that in Mexico, about 50% of people who receive remittances live above the poverty line because of the remittances. That's significant. That indicates that these remittances have a powerful impact on the well-being of people. So these countries obviously are very interested in trying to find ways, respecting U.S. laws, respecting legislative processes, to encourage or express an interest in immigration reform that recognizes that people are in the United States to work. This is a touchy and difficult diplomatic issue, because ultimately our immigration laws are our laws. They're nobody else's. And they have to meet our needs and our concerns, but they do have consequences outside. And in this regard, the foreign ministries of Mexico, the Central American countries, Panama, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic have begun a series of meetings at the level of the foreign minister to discuss immigration issues. And what's interesting about these discussions is that they have decided to frame the discussions in regional terms. In other words, they have decided not to focus them on the United States, but to focus them more broadly, because they recognize that although in many instances the United States is the end target of migration, that migration actually flows through lots of countries. I mean, if you're a Guatemalan, or let's say you're a Salvadoran, better yet a Nicaraguan. If you're a Nicaraguan trying to get to the United States, you could go through Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico before you get to the United States. If you're a Bolivian, you know, you could find your way going by land through Peru, Colombia, and up, or by sea going through Ecuador and then coming into Guatemala and then working your way up. And as people move through these societies, they sometimes spend time in these societies and work illegally as they move up the chain, depending on how much money they have. They present the same kind of resource issue in those countries that they present in the United States, but also they're subject to attack and to abuse, because they effectively have no profile or no legal presence or rights. And the fact that these countries and these foreign ministries are prepared to understand the phenomenon regionally, I think is very helpful, because it allows us to have a dialogue with them about migration, which is much less contentious than it would be if they came to us as if to present demands, or as if to act as advocates for citizens living inside the United States only.
Mr. Deffenbaugh made the observation that, of course, there are different points of view with respect to the positiveness or negativism of immigration. The question which he asks is, can we learn from the European Union about the connection between free movement of goods on one hand and people on the other?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. I mean, I think the immediate response is yes. I mean, obviously, there's a lot we can learn about integration from other efforts at integration around the world. The kind of integration that we've been pursuing in the Western Hemisphere, though, is a bit different than what's happened in the European Union, where they really have, attempted to create, to a certain degree, not only a level of economic integration, but also political integration. And it's a combination of those two that has allowed for considerably open borders and frontiers. We're seeing something similar in Central America through the Central American integration system, where as Central American countries, largely because of our free trade agreements, look for ways to link their national infrastructures, their road networks and their port networks, also recognize that the countries are small enough that you can create huge bottlenecks at border crossings. And therefore, they have looked for ways to reduce their customs and their immigration requirements to promote a freer flow of people and of goods and services. Obviously, in the United States, this is really what the whole immigration debate is about, to a certain extent. And my guess is that you'd be hard-pressed to find people who would argue that the United States needs to open its borders simply because of what could happen. But we do have to recognize that as we promote economic integration, as we look for ways to facilitate the movement of goods and services, we need to find ways to regularize the movement of people and to do it in a way that's that is connected in some fashion to our larger economic integration.
What is your prognosis and evaluation of the possibilities of laying economic foundations in the country of South America in order to stabilize those society in terms of social movement and economic development?
It's a very good question. And if you look at the social indicators in the region, they're almost all on the upswing, whether it's infant mortality, whether it's access to potable water, whether it's access to education. They've all improved over time from the 90s. But what we found is that as this improvement has happened, people want more. They recognize that they have, with the right kinds of decisions made by their governments and the right kind of resources provided by their governments, but also by external donors, that they have an opportunity to reach the point where they can take advantage of economic opportunity. And this is what creates the political effervescence. And what's interesting about democracy in Latin America is that Latin Americans are committed to democracy in the sense that they tend to vote at levels higher than the U.S. votes. Of course, in many countries, voting is mandatory, and you can be fined if you don't vote. But even still, the tendency is for these people to vote. But what's interesting is that they have an understanding of democracy which, while it has the institutional components that we do, has some interesting twists to it. To begin with, because of the path of democratization in the history of Latin America, especially the movement from authoritarian governments to elected governments, there tends to be a big focus on civil liberties and individual liberties. And they tend to understand democracy in terms of their individual freedom. In other words, they don't necessarily understand it in terms of institutions. But also, they understand it in terms of the benefits that are provided to them. And this is a reflection of societies that are profoundly disequal or unequal, whatever the word is. In this sense, in some ways, the Latin American understanding of democracy is more akin to the French Revolution understanding of democracy than to the American Revolution understanding of democracy. in the sense that equality is a profoundly important component. Now, equality was important in the United States, but I would argue that it wasn't seen as equality in economic equality or equality in terms of access to services. It was a different kind or understanding of equality. But as I mentioned earlier, the reason democracy has to deliver the goods is because they are expected and because there is a belief in the region that ultimately states have to have an important role in addressing inequality. In that regard, my own prognosis for the region is that if they make the right kinds of decisions and they have the access to the right kinds of resources, they can be successful. Because ultimately, the region, as difficult as the social problems it faces are, it's better than a lot of regions in the world. Let me give you an example. Several months ago, I went to Asia. I went to Japan, South Korea, and China. The reason I did this is because there are countries outside of the region that have strategic interests inside the region, both in Europe and in Asia. And as we look at the kinds of political decisions and economic decisions that countries are going to be making, we should be encouraging those people who have strategic interests in Latin America to be engaging with Latin American countries and expressing their own desire to see political stability and economic success. When I was in China, which everyone assumes is an economic juggernaut of enormous proportions, we were doing kind of the first ever consultations between the Chinese government and the U.S. government on Latin America. And the deputy foreign minister of China, in the course of these consultations, said, please remember, the average per capita income in Latin America is $3,000 per person. In China, it's $1,500. So he said, from my point of view, we're a poor country. Latin America is a wealthy area. And we have a lot to learn from Latin America. Now, if you've ever been to Shanghai or to any of these other boom towns, you find this hard to believe. But the reality is that Latin America is better than sub-Saharan Africa. It's better than South Central Asia. It's better than large parts of China and large parts of Asia, which means it has a chance. It has a chance politically, it has a chance economically, it has a chance socially. So I guess my bottom line response is that this is a region that can do good for itself, but it's got to make the right kinds of decisions, and it's got to operate in an environment in which it's cooperating with all of those around it. Because ultimately, what makes for success in the region is not individual success, but it's group success.
I think every answer you've given to a question has been complete, rich, and most interesting. We thank you for a thoroughly informative evening. Thank you.